Well, hey everybody, and welcome to Today Matters. My name is Jeremy, and today I want to share with you a verse that when I read it in my quiet time a few weeks ago, it stopped me in my tracks. You ever had that happen? You're reading the Bible and you come across a verse that just hits you. Well, that's what happened to me, and if I'm being honest, I was in kind of a rut in that moment. And sometimes you're in a rut and it's big and obvious and people around you notice and they know you're struggling. Other times though, you're in kind of a personal rut. And people around you don't pick up on it, but you do, and you know something's off. That was the kind of rut that I was in. And I came across this verse. It's Galatians 6, verse 4, and it says this: "Pay careful attention to your own work, for then you will get the satisfaction of a job well done, and you won't need to compare yourself to anyone else." See, it was that last part that really hit me, because comparison is something I struggle with. I have for a long time. I'm constantly comparing myself to the people around me, and perhaps you do too. Here's the thing you got to know about comparison. Comparison is never constructive. Comparison is only ever destructive. And if we're going to do something about it, if we're going to move past a comparison game, then we've got to understand that there are two types of comparison. And each one is going to require its own approach. And today, I want to talk about both types and what we can do about it. The first type is one in which you're comparing yourself to others in a way where you're looking down on somebody else. And usually the inner dialogue for this sounds something like this: well, I may not be perfect, but at least I'm not as bad as these people, right? And we're comparing ourselves kind of on a curve. The Bible has something to say about that. Jesus told a parable in Luke chapter 18 about a priest and a sinner who went to the temple. The priest walks in and he prays loud and proud, "God, thank you that I'm not like all these other people, not like these sinners and cheaters and adulterers. I fast twice a week and I give a tenth of my income to you." Meanwhile, sinner walks in and this poor guy can't even raise his head, and he beats his chest and he says, "Have mercy on me, God, for I am a sinner." And Jesus wrapped up this parable by saying this: that those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Reminds me of something an old baseball coach used to tell me. He said, "Jeremy, there are two types of people in the world, those who are humble and those who are about to be." You see, the missing piece in this type of comparison is humility. If this is the type of comparison that you struggle with, then your next step is to grow in humility. And here's the thing about humility. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's about thinking more of God. Because when you understand how big God is, it changes your perspective on everything, including your view of yourself and your view on others. The second type of comparison is the complete opposite, right? If the first one is looking down on other people, the second type of comparison is looking up to others, right? You want something that they have, something that you don't have. And here's the danger around all of that, is that list is never ending. You can always look at something you don't have. Someone has a better car than you, a bigger house than you, they live in a better neighborhood, they're more popular, they're a better parent, you name it, you can come up with your own list of something someone else has that you don't have. The Bible gives us a really good example of this type of comparison in 1 Samuel chapter 8. And here we see the nation of Israel, who was God's chosen people. They were holy, they were set apart, and most of all, they had God as their leader, something no other country could say at that time. And yet, they still weren't content. Let's read about it in 1 Samuel 8, verse 4. It says, "Finally, all the elders of Israel met at Ramah to discuss the matter with Samuel. 'Look,' they told him, 'you're now old and your sons aren't like you. Give us a king to judge us like all the other nations have.'" See, at this time, the people of Israel had God as their leader. They had something that no other country could say, right? That they had him as their leader. And yet, that's not how they saw it. They were consumed by what they didn't have. They looked at all of the other countries around them. They all had kings, and they said, "We want to be like that." And why? Because they weren't content. Here's God's response. We'll skip down to verse 9. God says, "Do as they ask, but solemnly warn them about the way a king will reign over them." So Samuel passed on the Lord's warning to the people who were asking him for a king. "This is how a king will reign over you," Samuel said. And then he proceeds to share what I think is one of the most hilarious paragraphs in the Bible, because Samuel shares line by line all of the things that a king is going to ask of the people, and they're not good. Spoiler alert. And yet, after all of these warnings, at the end of it, the people say, yeah, but we want a king anyway. You ever had a time where your kids wanted something really, really bad, but you knew it wasn't good for them? Maybe it was dangerous, it wasn't healthy for them. You can warn them all you want, but sometimes the only way they're going to learn is if you let them find out for themselves the hard way. That's what God did here. And God gave them a king, a man by the name of Saul. And if you know anything about this story, you know it didn't end well for Saul, and it didn't end well for the people of Israel. And it all happened because they weren't content. They didn't look at what they had, they looked at what they didn't have, and they compared themselves to others. Let's circle back to the verse we started with, Galatians 6, verse 4. It says, "Pay careful attention to your own work, for then you'll get the satisfaction of a job well done, and you won't need to compare yourself to others." See, God gives us the solution at the very beginning of this verse. If you don't want to compare yourself to others, then what do? You pay careful attention to your own work. You know what a lot of us are doing right now? We're paying careful attention to someone else's work. We're paying careful attention to someone else's calling for their life and what God has called of them and His plans for those people, instead of focusing on God's calling for us. What does God put right in front of you? What are you a steward of? What do you need to pay careful attention to? Because when you do that, you'll get the satisfaction of a job well done, and you won't need to compare yourself to others. You ever heard the saying, the grass is greener on the other side of the fence? Well, here's the thing. Grass isn't greener on the other side of the fence. The grass is greener where you water it.